going to start.
Fantastic. I'm assuming that I can begin.
Good day to you all and welcome to Huma Book Launch Seminar Series. This is a platform of acknowledging and critically engaging with scholarly books themed on Africa. This is one of our numerous seminar series, each with a unique engagement and all of which are detailed on our website. This is the 17th session of our book launch series. And today our special guests are Dr. Chalklen and Dr. Qambela. Please note that this session is being recorded onto Zoom and is broadcasted onto our Facebook page. My name is Minenhle Ncube and I am a doctoral fellow at Huma. And as I've mentioned, we have Dr. Warren Chalklen and Dr. Qambela, who will speak about their book, Anti-Racist Teaching Practices and Learning Strategies. Dr. Chalklen began his career as an urban scholar in South Africa, where he witnessed the impact of racial inequity on educational outcomes. His education and research background include public administration, education policy, urban education, curriculum and instruction. He's a passionate advocate for equity and justice and does work on advancing health equity. He leads language access services as well as the execution of system-wide diversity and inclusion. His broad scope of responsibilities also incorporate patient, associate, and organizational transformation by integrating data, technology, and high-impact diversity, equity and inclusion in learning spaces. He has trained teachers in New York on how to use data to advocate for equity in their classrooms. Alongside him is Dr. Qambela, who is an award-winning educator and senior lecturer at the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies at the University of Johannesburg. He teaches medical anthropology, anthropological theories, and childhoods and youth. He is a research fellow at the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities and is currently working on a monograph broadly around what he terms the anthropology of boyhoods, in which he argues for more attention to the interior lives of boys. His phenomenal PhD was an ethnographic exploration of the lives of AmaXhosa boys and men living in a rural and peri-urban context in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. Today, both Warren and Gcobani will speak on their book, Anti-Racist Teaching Practices and Learning Strategies, and they say it's a tool of love and justice. This text is imbued in their own research and teaching experiences, learning strategies, which we will hear today. And in this book, you can expect a presentation of theories, practices, and personal narratives that reveal the embodiments and commitments to an anti-racist and love for ethical education. Thank you so much, Warren and Gcobani, for coming to Huma. We look forward to hearing more about your wonderful book. You may have the floor.
Thank you. Siyabonga, assalamu alaikum, sanbonani, molweni. From just this energy and love, I want to just start by honoring our ancestors and those that have come before us. The work that we, Gcobani and I, have produced together but nothing is new. It's just a different sort of way of thinking about this, but we want to honor those scholars and researchers and lived experiences that imbue this project. I'm going to begin from the premise that we live in an unjust world. And I wanted us to take a moment to breathe that in, that we do not live in a neutral world, that we live in an unjust world. And the question that we ask ourselves is, what are the mechanisms of injustice around us? And the dominant narratives that surround us is that injustice lives in people. If we can fix people, then we can fix injustice. And the question we then ask ourselves is, for over 400 years, racial injustice, racial oppression has permeated, colonization has permeated. And so if it's just about people and those people who created these systems have died, Why do we still live in this unjust context? And the question that then asks of us is, can we look deeper into the mechanisms of education that socialize us to affirm the world as it is, or challenge the world so that we can create it into what we believe it should be? And if we look into this world and affirm it as it is, this unjust world, we affirm it. Yes, it's normal. It's normal to see injustice around us. It's normal to see oppression around us. It's normal to see dehumanization around us. It means that we have received messages. We have received ways of being, seeing, doing, and relating, as Ntabiseng Motseme says, that normalize the inhumanity around us. And education is one of the fundamental mechanisms in which this happens, in which the world is affirmed, meaning is mobilized for the powerful to maintain their position. Okay. So with that context, I humbly ask the question, in my own life, how can I, as a teacher in a classroom, how can I make a difference? How can I be an instrument of change? How can I struggle against these different forces? And as we asked those questions together, Qcobani and I, we came from the premise that a system is not going to give you the tools to dismantle it. The system itself is not going to allow you or create or produce tools and knowledge to challenge it, because it exists to reproduce itself. There's no such thing as a broken system, okay? It's designed this way, okay? And so with that question, Qcobani and I, we walked on a journey of trying to really unpack what would it look like to think through decolonization, anti-racism, anti-oppression, not just in theory, but in practice. How do we concretize this? And so anti-racist teaching practices and learning strategies thinks about decolonization, thinks about anti-racism, thinks about anti-oppression through 5 key lenses. The first one is knowledge. Whose knowledge? And how is knowledge mobilized? How is knowledge embodied with social power? What we know doesn't come from somewhere, okay? It actually is chosen specifically because it harbors the values of those with power. Okay, and we'll talk a bit more about that. The second piece is, once we have deconstructed whose knowledge, our next question is to think about our lesson preparation. How do we prepare our lessons? How do we prepare ourselves for liberation? How do we prepare ourselves for engaging in a process in which we are both the teacher and the learner simultaneously? Paulo Freire. Okay, the teacher and the learner. How do we resist that? How do we prepare ourselves to not embody hierarchies, colonial relationships and hierarchies? So lesson preparation was critical. The third piece was, once you prepared for your lessons, how do you manage your classroom? Classroom management. What we find is that the teacher, even the design of the classroom, is centered with the teacher at the front of the classroom, in the center of the classroom. And the more the students are passive in their relationship with the teacher, even in the design, they're sitting at their desks. When you talk to teachers and they say a successful classroom is a classroom in which students are quiet at their desks, we realize that we are managing the classroom in a specific way. So we have knowledge, lesson preparation, content. The fourth piece is teaching strategies. You know how many times you walk up to a desk and write up to the board and write a concept, photosynthesis on the board. Then we say, okay, what does everyone know about photosynthesis? Then we just draw what the students say. Okay, well, let me tell you what photosynthesis is. And this domination that occurs where the student's opinion and experiences is completely irrelevant, because you're just warming them up to deposit your own knowledge into them. Okay. We asked ourselves, how can we create teaching strategies that actually center the lived experiences of the learner, the student, the engager in the classroom? How can we shift this idea of a teacher into this idea of a transformer, a change agent in the classroom? In other words, how can we describe photosynthesis not only in the mind, but in the body. How can a learner make a connection that they are part of this world, that the natural environment that they live in, this process in which that trees go through to produce the oxygen that we breathe, it's relevant to them, not only intellectually, but emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And it connects to issues of land, it connects to issues of justice, okay? And finally, assessment. How do we shift into socially just assessment, recognizing that assessment is used as a weapon against justice? It's used to control what teachers do. It turns them into workers and not professionals. It weaponizes funding. It weaponizes what is valued. And it's through assessment that we ultimately decide who is valuable and what is valuable. And so in synopsis, this book is imbued with activities, but it's also imbued, as Qobani will most likely talk about. He brought a lot of narratives, the experiences of teachers. I love hearing about them all the time when we connect. But in synopsis, when you enter into this work, there's not many answers in there. There's not solutions, there's not formulas, there's questions. And that's because we're all in process. We're all learning, we're all engaging. And we didn't want to create a book that just gave a step-by-step checklist. We embodied a set of questions that hopefully will open up a new set of questions and ultimately lead us into thinking through the world less as a colonial space and more as a human-centered, liberatory, and loving space. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, my friend Gcobani. I hope I've done justice to the incredible work that you've done as well, Gcobani. So I'm going to hand it over to you. You know I can talk a lot, brother. So hey, over to you, my friend.
No, that was perfect. That was perfect. Thank you so much, Warren, and certainly thank you to Huma, Mimi, and your team for the invitation for us to discuss our book today. As Warren has said, so much of my interest and much of my contributions for anyone who's read the book or who's seen it certainly contributes to sort of the lived and embodied experiences of not just the teachers in the classroom, but also certainly the experiences of the learners. So it's important to really, for myself, to really ground myself within my training. So I'm trained in anthropology, and anthropology has always been tainted and was central to advocating for the colonial mission. So as both a student and as a teacher, I've always experienced both the humanizing potential of education, but also seeing the ways in which education has been used for dehumanization. So both Warren and I's starting point from the book was really this idea that there's no such thing as neutral education. Education is always imbued in politics, and it reflects the particular politics of the time. So it's not surprising that, you know, much of anthropology has always been, was used up until the late 1960s to advance colonial mission through the ways in which Black people were written about, indigenous peoples and so on as natives and savages, uncivilized and so on. So one of the first things I thought about in sort of preparing for my short little intro to the book was one of my students, Tamsang, on a last course that I just taught now. So this narrative is actually not in the book, but maybe in a future edition it will be there. And it was interesting. So I was teaching ethnography. And one of the things he said to me was, if we know that education has been used to dehumanize minoritized persons, people of color and Black people all over the world, can we ever really use this education for liberatory purposes? And I thought that was such a profound question, and I've always gone back to it and sort of thinking about, even though the question didn't exist at the time of the book, but I think it is imbued in what Warren and I are thinking through throughout the book, which is really how do we create a humanizing context in education that brings particularly marginalized persons back into their humanities. So really what I want to do is to really start thinking about some of the concepts that I work through, or certainly that we work through in the book and in our contributions. And the first one is really this idea of embodied education, right? Or the idea of embodiment. So I see a lot of anthropologists in the room, so they would know quite a lot about it. But embodiment is the idea that you're not separate from what is happening within your body. You can't have that mind-body separate split, but that what happens to you affects you in so many, it affects your soul, your spirit, and so many others. So whenever, throughout the book, you'll see that we talk a lot around, you know, the importance of the individual story, the importance of people's embodied sort of realities. And then really the other concept that we think about is really this concept of really coming from Paulo Freire, bell hooks, which is this idea of educating for critical consciousness. So I teach in a particular context where many of my students come from low-income backgrounds, have experienced various forms of structural economic violence. So how do we educate kids, young people who've been marginalized, who've gone through so much violence in its broadest meaning? How do we educate them in ways that they're able to get tools from education that allow them to be able to provide some kind of upliftment in their lives? And one of the key things that we talk about in the book is really to get there is that we have to humanize education. Because when you look, there's so many studies and books that have been done all over the world that really show the dehumanizing experiences of particularly Black kids in relation to higher education. So how do we use education? How do we think about it in ways that really we can use for rehumanization? And part of that is also then also thinking about this area of sort of trauma-informed care, right? So a lot of the time when we think about trauma, we think the big T, right? Which is, you know, you've been in a massive car accident, something horrible has happened to you, you've witnessed a loved one being killed, but also what happens in those minute instances in the classroom where, you know, your assignment is marked low, or, you know, I don't know if I talk about it. No, I actually don't. But I didn't discuss it in the book. But, you know, I remember in my undergrad years, one of my lecturers, you know, couldn't believe that I had written the essay and did everything they could to try to prove that it was plagiarized up until they could not. But think about what that does to you, because my white peers, that wasn't done to them. If they performed excellently, it was always assumed, right, that is their work. So what do those little micro sort of aggressions, what do they do in terms of limiting our lessons? And then also one of the things we're thinking about in the book is really this idea of creative and authentic learning, right? How do we, because a lot of the times when we think about sort of anti-racist practices, we think about really big things, but also how do we create a humane atmosphere for learning that promotes creative pursuits and so on in the classroom. And then also we draw quite a lot. So although the book is about anti-racist practices, but we also do draw a lot quite from feminist pedagogies. We draw from critical pedagogy and so on. There's issues that go way beyond race that we tackle, issues of the gendered experiences of the classroom, issues of disability, issues of class, sexuality, and so many others. And all of these are around how to think about how do we, you know, create isidima, that's what the term in isiXhosa, which is dignity, right? Where young people leave our classroom dignified rather than, you know, leaving them dehumanized. And one of the ways in which I talked about, that we talk about in the book is really this idea of storytelling as well. That's one of the ways in which anytime I start, particularly pre-COVID, when I was on campus, I would always start the term by getting to know the students a little bit. They'd write me little short excerpts. What are their dreams? Why do they want to? Why are they studying anthropology with their degrees and so on? And I think that through that storytelling, you get to learn a little bit more about the person in your classroom. And it really promotes, I guess, what we call engaged pedagogy, where everyone feels that in the classroom setting that they matter, that they have something to contribute. And so part of that also requires that we move from these insular ideas in education that are so prevalent, that focus on the I. Warren and I have conversations about Ubuntu all the time, which is how do we really start to draw from each other's humanity rather than to draw out each other's humanity. And part of that is participatory engagement in the classroom, where every voice has a space to be heard and to be able to and to be able to contribute. And part of this is also informed by literature that really shows that, you know, we have to focus on the so-called 4 big C's, and that is critical thinking. Young people should be able to read, you know, texts critically. So even if you're reading an old ethnography where people are written about in dehumanizing terms, how do you read that text critically? Communication in the classroom. There's not one, as humans, we are emotionally contagious. We are always communicating. So how do we promote young people to be able to express their views in the classroom and so on? Importantly, collaboration. It was important for Warren and I throughout this book that it be a true collaboration between us. And also we are thinking about also in the classroom, how do you as an educator move from just being the person who is insular or who is assumed to have the knowledge, but also to see students as co-creators with you. So collaboration is important. And then importantly, creativity. You'll see throughout the book that we do play on combining critical theory with sort of narratives, poetry, music lyrics. There's so many diverse ways in which we can promote different ways of knowing in the classroom. And then importantly, I think just not to be too expensive, as Warren has said, that this is also a labor of love. But we think a lot in the book around how to promote love in the classroom, relationship building between students and the staff, relationship students between the teacher and the learners, and how do we create an atmosphere where the L word is not so feared anymore in the classroom, but that it becomes a daily practice. And I think I want to just close by sort of saying that there's a quote that I love, that joy and learning must coexist. And I think with this book, although it is around anti-racist teaching practices, it's much bigger than that. What we are really for, anti-racist teaching practices and learning strategies is really our way of saying, how do we create love and joy in the classroom and to create that humanizing context? Yeah, I think let me stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you both for sharing that wonderful outline of your book, which I think is very important and a relevant text in many learning spaces today. I've drawn so much lessons or points from your book, rather, on thinking about humanizing education. And I'm more interested, at least for myself, I'm more interested to hear of more from your own. Of course, you did give examples from your experience, Qcobani, as well. What were the most critical moments, for example, throughout your career where you really felt the need for more engagement in an educational space? That's what I'm interested to hear from either of you.
Warren, there's a beautiful story you share in the book, the Qambela example. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I'm sorry, which example, Qcobani?
The Qambela poem.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. So of course, I'm a teacher in the classroom. I think I'm woke. I think I have arrived as someone who is anti-racist. And I think, you know what I'm going to do is teach Makosa Xanaxaba's poem Hair, which I highly recommend, by the way. And so I get up there, we put it on the syllabus alongside all white literature, right? And we put it on there, and now we're going to teach this poem. And so we are looking at register, and we are looking at tone, and we are underlining the words. And we're going through this piece, and my embodied self as a teacher is feeling so, I couldn't sleep the night before because I thought, my goodness, this is just so beautiful and powerful. And then as we begin to do this work, as we begin to really unpack this poem, unpack this piece, I begin to realize that actually, as soon as the student brought in their own interpretation, as soon as the student began to talk about the significance of Black hair, the significance of hair in relationships with other women, and these private moments in which hair really brings people together, those were irrelevant in my mind because I cared about what was significant in terms of my interpretation of this text. And so knowledge, in other words, changing the syllabus to reflect can be used to reproduce the power dynamics and the power structures that existed in the classroom. In other words, just because we change the syllabus does not mean that we are not perpetuating forms of dehumanization and oppression in the classroom. And that is something I want to stress. And I'll give you another example. I speak isiZulu, and since I've been outside of the Zulu context, my Zulu has been a bit sporadic, I must be honest. But I had a question with someone who speaks isiZulu and said, you know what, because I speak isiZulu, therefore, you know, I am practicing human-centered education because I can speak the learner's language. And my question, the problem I posed was, just because you speak isiZulu, does that mean that you have completely removed yourself of the oppressive spaces that you have in yourself? Okay, so in other words, we have to be careful that just because we have things that look like justice, we have to peel back the layers and ask ourselves fundamental questions about the practice of justice in the classroom, the practice of humanity in the classroom. In other words, in my classroom, by the way, my classroom, the learners were seated quietly with red pens and underlining and crossing out and writing down what they think I wanted to hear. Now, the question is, they're getting an A on the test. And in my mind, they have learned. But the question in front of all of us is, what kind of learning and for whose benefit are they learning? And is this decolonized teaching and learning? And so what we ultimately resulted in is me dominating those learners with my interpretation of knowledge, my understanding of knowledge. And I used my power of assessment, and I used my classroom management and my teaching strategies to subdue their bodies so that I could insert my perspectives, my ways of being and doing into their lived experiences. And I created a dichotomy whereby, in their sense, and the learners, you know, in conversations with them will say to you, Mr. Chalklen, unless I give you what you want, I'm not going to pass this test. And if I don't pass this test, I'm not going to get an A. And if I don't get an A, then I'm not going to get into university. And if I don't get into university, I might not get a job. And if I don't get a job, what's going to happen to me? And so the structures of the economic, social, and political structures come down to those decisions of not only what we teach, but how we teach it, and the power dynamics that's given to us as teachers in the classroom. And so again, that system, that hierarchy is reproduced even in the micro decisions I'm making about how I manage the space. Now, as a contrast, decolonized and anti-racist teaching does not necessarily mean that we throw out the test, although sometimes that's important, but we teach against it. We recognize our perspectives as teachers and our biases. We name those in the classroom. In other words, we say things like, this is my bias. This is my limited perspective. This is my lived experience. What do we think about this? What are the critical issues? How do they relate to other issues in the classroom? And ultimately, the learners are able to pass this examination, the matric examination, which is standard, but they also leave with a critical analysis of themselves within the social, political, and economic context. And they can read when they're being acted against. And so in summary, in closing on this question, that's my personal experience of dominating students, and I dominate students and people in different ways without realizing it. And this book is about acknowledging and working through that as educators.
Wow, thank you for sharing that and unpacking that so very well for us to understand the injustices or the structures on a macro level, which I think, at least I speak for myself, I take for granted a lot. And just hearing how they inform those micro decisions does really show that the challenges of approaching this decolonially as teachers and as learners, how to relearn in a different way. I'm reflecting even on my own experience as a student of how these structures informed my way of, limited my way of learning, my way of reflection, which I still struggle with today. I'm still trying to unpack as a PhD student. And I think, yeah, it's I don't know what else to say. Qobani, do you want to say or add anything to Warren's description?
Sure, yeah. I mean, when you asked that, I actually thought that it would be very difficult for me to link it to one particular moment, because finally, about a few weeks back, I had an epiphany that all of these moments were actually connected, even though they seemed like isolated moments. And I can think of 3 primary moments in my life that really changed my relationship to education. And the first one is my own mother. My own mother was a teacher. She was a community builder. And I watched her both create humanizing context in the classroom, but also various kinds of dehumanizing experiences from all levels. So from both students, from education, formal structures, to her peers as a woman in the classroom. And a lot of the times, I started school when I was very young. I was 4 when I was in grade 1. So I used to go around with her a lot to meetings and so on. So that's one moment that I was not really conscious of, but that I think the older I get, that I'm able to make connections to, oh, this is why I'm able to make sense of issues. So my mother, and then the second one is I went to predominantly Black schools up until I went to university. So the second moment for me, that was really informative in how I think about race and critical race theory and structures of education, was changing to moving from a context where predominantly all of my teachers were predominantly Black. And really, of course, we know that white supremacy can be present, right, even with the absence of white people. But generally, race did not concern us at school. It was around your academic abilities and so on. So to move from that context and into a context where I'm challenged, and it's very evident that I'm challenged predominantly because I am a Black person, because the same thing is not happening to my white peers, that was quite a formative moment, attending a predominantly white student, in terms of not just radicalizing me, but also really allowing me to really understand the way race is always imbued in our learning and in our education structures. And then the third one was more recent. It was about 2 or 3 years ago, with a particular 2 courses that I write about in the book. One was really, really badly reviewed. And I go to the reasons for that, that I won't go into that. But instead of going into the ego, I really started to look at the feedback around what are students saying. They found the course not contextually relevant. They found it too Eurocentric. They found it so detached from our current moment in South Africa. This was just post, fees must fall, rules must fall, quote unquote, new decolonial era, post-apartheid, and so on. And so it was very hurtful for me. But instead of really sort of going into the ego and saying this course was brilliant and so on, I started to think about, what would be the strategies and so on that I would use in order to capture the imaginations of our students, or the contemporary Black African child that I teach at the university. And I go into some of those strategies there. It was around really centering scholars from the global South. So it doesn't necessarily just mean, putting in Black people there, because Black people can write about Black people in ways that are dehumanizing, right? But it's around really finding scholars who write about Black humanity in humanizing ways. It was around thinking about new ways of assessment. So I looked into using online assessments, blog posts, looking into reading journals and so on. So I don't want to be too expensive around that particular course, but that was the first course that I actually won a teaching award for. And from those 3 moments, my moments with my mother, the moments of attending a predominantly white institution, and then also the challenges I faced earlier on in terms of my teaching life, and the kinds of changes I've had to do, not just as a scholar, but also as an individual, in terms of, because I also write about the importance of the mode of relation, right, with my students. When I started, I wanted them to see I'm smart and that I'm the brightest of all, and that, I can be tough. But I really realized that that had a distancing approach. Most students, unless they are mean, of which we know they can be, but most students, unless they are mean, I actually often go into the classroom assuming that you are qualified, which is why you are in front of them. So once I let go of that sort of egocentricness and to start to really sort of in some ways show my heart to the students and what I want them to get, I think it really profoundly changed my teaching. But I don't want to be too expensive. But that's what I would add imminently.
Thank you, Gcobani. Thanks, Warren. I just want to offer my own thoughts as you've been speaking about these macro structures that are very predominant and very hegemonic to us. I think I will play the devil's advocate in this by thinking about, okay, it's really, you share some really important methodologies or theories of approaching teaching and learning decolonially in ways that, for example, I wrote it down somewhere, I can't find it. Anyway, in ways that are liberating for learners, in ways that harness humanizing education, moving away from trauma-informed care, for example. But I mean, I'm a bit worried by, of course, I speak because I'm in the 4IR, or the Fourth Industrial Revolution, an AI research group. I'm imagining the technologies that are being designed for pedagogical reasons or for teaching or learning. If we are in a world where machines are being programmed in a non-transformative way and are being distributed at a mass scale for learners, how might we tackle, for instance, these challenges that might be accelerating? Of course, I don't have an example of technologies at the back, right at the tip of my tongue, but how might we, fight against that tide of programming or machine learning that's programmed to say, to work against everything that you are trying to bring forth? And there's some questions in the chat, but I can read them afterwards.
Sure. I mean, I can give it a go. So Warren and we have to just be honest about it, which is we do write a bit in the book about sort of the impact of technology and how it's affected learning and teaching and so on. But admittedly, I think at the time of writing, certainly even now, actually, we still, I guess, in liminality around what technology is doing to education. We know it can enhance it, right? In the sense that students have greater availability of information. You no longer have to travel to far distance libraries and so on. You can get, within a click, a PDF and so on. So there is good to this quote unquote 4IR moment in what it means for our learning in terms of access, right, to information. But we also know, of course, particularly in the African continent, it's a very classed access, and we've seen it with COVID, right, which is the kids who attend very elite private expensive schools have been really able to continue unabated in this moment. And we know that there's been very little learning that has actually taken place. I read a stat, and I hope, because this is recorded, I hope I'm not getting it wrong, but it's amazing. I don't want to say it, but the implications was that so many young girls have actually dropped out in South Africa in this time period of COVID. So we've already we were losing half of the people who start in grade 1. And now we know that in some ways this moment has been exacerbated by COVID. But anyways, to get to your question around the internet and sort of the ways in which it's been used, I think it can be used for good. But I also think it's much more nuanced in terms of the practicalities and the ethics around it. So, I mean, there's a scholar in the US who wrote a whole book about what online learning will mean. And actually the key argument she made was that online learning is never going to replace in-person learning. But what's going to happen is, because then when greater people have access to the internet and to access those education, it decreases in terms of value. So her key argument was that actually then going to campus and being able to afford to live in res and so on is going to be the new elite. So those are going to be the new private colleges that really reproduce inequalities. So on the one hand, it can promote, and we've seen it certainly, not to be at UCT, the online high school that you are with, although it's been advocated to sort of promote education equity, we know that also, you know, for 2,000 rands a month in South Africa, that's like the median household income for the majority of the population. So who is able to access this digital moment? But I don't want to be too expensive. What do you think, Warren?
Yeah, well, I think about the printing press. I think about the gun. I think about the pen. And I think about the fact that we have had technology that on its own is an object, a tool. But the truth is, you know, the gun in the hand of Thomas Sankara or the gun in the hand of Cecil John Rhodes, the printing press in the hands of missionaries or the printing press in the hands of revolutionaries. And the question then becomes not about the technology, but the ways in which we think about things, the ways in which we reflect on our engagement with ideas, content, and experiences. Because if we are not, you know, there's something to say that either you are playing or being played. And so the question then becomes, with technology, of course, there are equity, there are access, there's all sorts of pieces. But the truth is, unless we are thinking about what we are consuming, we are actually being played consciously or subconsciously by what is being put in front of us. So technology, of course, is the next reproductive process of colonization, because the incentive is to provide access, but also to turn us into consumers. For example, we have something called the attention economy. The attention economy. In other words, the number of minutes that our eyes and our brains and our hearts and our spirits are looking at a screen is commodified. Now the question is, fine, commodify me. I need to access this information, commodify me, fine. But am I aware and reflecting and reading against this process? Am I aware of the ways in which I'm being manipulated? Am I aware of the ways in which information is being presented to me? Am I thinking through these issues? And so, you know, I have a lot of parents who say, Warren, I don't want my kids to have an iPad, or I don't want them to have a phone, because I'm scared of what that's going to do to them. And through empathy, I empathize. But my question to them is, are you having conversations with your learner, with you're a guardian of students, of learners? Are you having conversations about unearthing the ways in which you are being manipulated? We all consume marketing, and we know it's marketing. We know it's trying to manipulate us. But are we thinking against it? Are we reflecting against the values that underpin that marketing, the stereotypes, the tropes? You know, we think about the Nando's commercial with Gareth Cliff and John Steenhuisen and Balyantuli, and we reflect on the fact that Nando's is sponsoring racism, right? And manipulating us into this environment. And so the question is not the knowledge itself, it's how we think about it, how we engage with it. And that is the difference between humanization and dehumanization. Humanization is an active posture. Decolonization is an active posture. Anti-racism, anti-oppression is an active analysis, engagement, discernment with the world. Everything else, oppression, relates to this sort of passive or submissive process. And so we cannot get away from it. When we shift into redesigning and reimagining the world, we can get into those processes which we need to. But in the meantime, we need to be really, really careful about how we think about these things and how they impact us.
Yeah. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for unpacking that so beautifully. I would like to move to the chat. There are several questions, and I'll ask my colleagues if they can unmute themselves to articulate their questions. Questions from Divine Fu and Minga. The first questions are from Divine. Divine, is it possible for you to express your questions to the authors?
Okay, I was hoping I won't, but Warren and Qambela, thank you, Gcobani, for your presentation and also for just the opportunity of reading the book. So mine are just follow-up questions with related to some of the core arguments in the book, and especially your emphasis on humanizing and deracializing and also decolonizing. And I'm just asking the question to push further for reflection, what it means to talk about dehumanizing in a space whose core purpose is about expertise, producing experts, and expertise is a kind of a currency within this space, whether it's with those who are either producing knowledge or training people, or those who are critiquing these kinds of training. We saw with many spaces that part of the debate is around who has expert knowledge, and one expertise knowledge is replaced by another expertise knowledge. Even when students critique the system, it's also about the fact that we also have expertise knowledge. So the idea of expertise doesn't seem to be contested. It's just who is an expert, in that space. Some would say the experts is everyone who works in that space. Others would say the experts is the trainer. Others would say the experts is the student. But no one seems to critique or interrogate this idea of expertise, that this is a space which seems to privilege a particular kind of knowledge. So that's the first a question, And then the second is just related to that. And given that this is a place of abstraction of violence, and that we tend to replace one form of violence by the other, and one form of bullying by the other, whether it's bullying about knowledge and others, and it's just asking you to reflect more around the idea of humanizing, what it means to humanize. Education for me is a kind of a catharsis, and every cathartic process is a violent process, because you learn by undoing. When you learn, it's kind of a violence because you undo what you have and replace it with something else. And so I'm just trying to understand how to humanize, which is a project that we're also trying to push, and from that context. And then the last is, it still relates to that, which is about education as a commodity, and knowledge as a commodity, learning as a commodity. And what's happened over time is that it's become this corporatized space where there's a relationship between a service provider and a client. Learners and students have become clients in this space. That's why also parents have a lot of power, and they can decide, because I pay for high quality education, and I need to get quality education. And the unfortunate thing is that in the process, even when you care, it is also a service that you provide to a client. And the question is like, how do you deal with this tension where care itself and humanizing itself has become a kind of a service that you must offer to a client because it's now a corporate space? Yeah, I can shut up now.
Qambela, would you like to take this question? I'm happy to.
Sure. I think I will take one part of it. Sorry, let me just switch on my video. And it's the question of humanization, right? I think in the book I talk about in one of my contributions, Bell Hooks' notion of what an intellectual is, right? And we know that organically an intellectual has never meant actually these sort of corporatized forms in which they take in these days. An intellectual is really any person. The true definition of of an intellectual is actually someone who seeks to be whole, right? So it's not about perfection in the ways in which it's been corporatized, right? In the rat race around publications, grants, and all of these other things that have come to play around it. So my response to that would be to remind ourselves that it's not like this, and it hasn't always been like this, and it's not like this everywhere. So in front of me, I have this book, actually. It's on sort of Finland, the education system in Finland. And that's an example of a successful education system in the global north that's not centered on any of these sort of Euro-American ideas around what excellence is, around dehumanizing students, obsessing over SATs and standardized testing and so on. And I think that's an example of a working education system that, shows that, you can have joy in the classroom and in ways that are, even the title of the book is around how they've created joyful classrooms for kids without letting go, of course, of the need to teach and to assess in very particular ways, but also looking at our own archives in the African continent, right? The ways in which we've learned historically, indigenous peoples all over the world. We know that education was never really around the ways in which it's been made to be a competitive endeavor. It was a very communal thing. In fact, like, any sort of young person I've spoken to, like myself, who grew up in rural areas, always speaks about, sorry, I'm on my phone and there's a text that just came through, which is disturbing my thought. We know that, the person who held the most knowledge was always the person who was most revered, but also people who held knowledge were always the people wanted to gather around in order to be able to take from that knowledge. So we know that it was always collaborative as an effort. It wasn't this competitive where it's like, if I have knowledge, then it just sticks with me. So just to not be too long-winded because I'm aware of the time, but my response to the humanizing education would be to remember that it's not like this, even in the world right now, that there are contexts where it's working, where education is humane, kids are happy, including the workers and so on, and that it doesn't have to always be the rat race that we've increasingly become accustomed to. But I'll let Warren take on the commodification question.
I'll try and be as quick as I can, but can I say that your questions all have a very common link? Here's the first piece. We talk about the fact that the education system does not produce, it's failing. Now, who is it failing in relation to? And the answer to that is the economy. It is not meeting the needs of the economy. Well, who does the economy serve? Okay, now let's peel back that question a little bit and understand that we have knowledge. And I want us to imagine this global universe, this expansive universe of what we call knowledge, which is the knowledge of the human, even environmental animals. There's just knowledge. But out of this expansive universe, certain knowledge is extracted from this plethora of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, there's all sorts of knowledge. It's extracted. And one of the first things that's done is it's then broken up into forms. And through an institution known as schooling, we then have this thing called subjects. And subjects are taught in classrooms. So automatically we have a classroom, a room designed to reproduce class structures. Okay. And this class structure is not only class, but we talk about class in terms of hierarchy. Okay, classes in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of all forms of things. Okay, now these subjects are, they're subjects ironically, but their purpose is to turn the students into objects, not subjects. Okay, into objects. Subjects take action, objects are passive. Okay, now this comes back to my original purpose, this original thread that I'm putting together, is that when we talk about a failing education system, when we talk about commodification of education, we have to understand that our bodies are commodified. The process of colonization first colonized a woman's body to produce not only labor, but to reproduce children. Men dominated that body. That's the colonial process. Racism, capitalism, these are all forms of domination. They're all forms of reproducing class in this room. Okay. And so as we think through how that is permeating, this construction of the expert is only given meaning in an institution. Okay, in an institution, this teacher, this principal, the headmaster in places is given authority by an institution, and that institution is built to embody the values of those with power. So what you're talking about, when you talk about commodification, it's embedded in all forms of this structure, okay, which is what we call the system, okay. So here's the question then, this violence that where we talk about. Yes, unlearning is a violent process, but it's also a process embedded in love and liberation. Because when we are commodified, we are extracted from. But anti-oppression and liberation is about understanding ourselves as full human beings and recognizing the ways in which we are commodified and challenging those ways in the classroom, in the decisions that we make, in the ways we manage the classroom, in the ways that we carve out spaces of resistance and solidarity. And if learners and teachers understand this, the context within which they are operating, the systems and the structures within which they are operating, they can then begin to make decisions about that. And that is the purpose of liberatory education. There's no point in dismantling and burning down the school unless we are whole as human beings at the same time, unless we embody love and compassion and empathy, whilst also taking these steps to transform the world and reimagine what it could look like. So these are the questions that we're trying to grapple with, Divine. So I thank you so much for your question. We don't have direct answers again. We're just unearthing further questions.
Thank you, Warren, for articulating that once again very well. We have another question from a colleague, Minga. Could I ask Minga to quickly ask his question and we wrap it up in 5 minutes?
Hi, Qcobani, at last. Repeat. Warren, how are you? I'm good.
Long time. Hi.
Yeah, long time. I don't have much to say because Divine has actually provided that question. And I think mine is so simple. It's in a chat. The question is, how do we legitimately offer reflection when our analysis remains forever unlocked in the interpretation? And also, what are the limits of reciprocity when teaching a marginalized community with limited knowledge, who are so paralyzed by a chronic dehumanizing lived reality? So that's just the question that I'm posing there, because everything has been said. I don't think I need to carry more. It's well done. But congratulations, by the way. And we need the book. Divine is there, our director. I'm placing an order. So Divine, please, this is the order that I'm placing for this book. We want that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Minga. I think that's a really important provocation. And I don't think I have one particular answer, but I think, both you and I are anthropologists, and this is what the one thing that we know, which is that people are really capable of textual analysis of their own lives. So throughout my schooling life, I had a commute. I would take at least 2 to 3 taxis to get home. And I was telling this to a friend that it was the most engaging space of pedagogy I've ever witnessed. Taxis in the morning, taxis at night, the kinds of conversations that are happening about political life, national, international events, the level of nuance. And a lot of those people who came from the kind of context I came in often did not have formal education, but in terms of how they thought about their lives and in terms of how they thought about what is happening to what is happening in their lives was actually probably one of the most sort of nuanced sort of classrooms I've ever been in, to be honest. But the key thing is really around what, Warren was hinting at, which is the kinds of knowledges that we tend to value. And I say this all the time to my students, because like I said, most of them come from low income backgrounds. And I say, write about your life, use this text to think about it, but many often don't. And I understand it because, of course, if they're in a classroom with only one person who allows this, and then they go to 5 other courses where they have to write in a very structured way, I understand the kind of tension that they are also in. But just to not be too long-winded, because I know we have to close. But I think part of that is to really understand that, that textual analysis is not limited to people with masters or PhDs and so on, and that people really, and I think that's why feminist scholars are so useful to me, people like Bell Hooks, Qambela, and so on, because they really show the ways in which knowledge the pedagogy literally is everywhere. And I think just 20 more seconds is that in terms of anthropology, Bell Hooks was the first person who really got me to think about domestic workers as organic anthropologists, because in terms of the work they do, they go to foreign environments, they often go back home and they have to report, this is what we saw, this is what is happening, this is how we make sense of it. But those people often are not valued in terms of the kinds of knowledge. So I think we have to really move away from the idea that you have to have a master's or a PhD in order to be able to contribute, and to really start to value all of those otherworldly knowledges that exist outside of the academy. Byron?
Yes, I'll give an experience I had when I started teaching. I was teaching in a rural area, and I was teaching with young learners who were quiet. I would engage them, they would not answer, and so I left saying, these children know absolutely nothing. They know absolutely nothing. But as my life has progressed, I've begun to rephrase the question around the culture of silence is reflective of the culture of power. And instead of reflecting on why they are so silent, let's reflect on the structures that have silenced these learners for so long. Let's reflect on the ways in which, as Qobani said, yes, you might have an opinion in my class, but all other educational experiences have operated in the model of, you shut up, I will talk, and you will just give me an answer to my question, right? So we have to think from the structure of silence. But secondly, we have to remove our own bias around who has knowledge. Again, I completely concur with you, Qobani, around who has knowledge. But the key thing is to have that patience and that empathy and that belief that who we are talking to is full of value and love and humanity and comes from experiences and has knowledge. We have to lead with the fact that everyone has knowledge. And that just because we have a title under our name, that's an institutional signal. But other than that, it means absolutely nothing. So we have to be okay with grappling with those pieces.
Wow. Wow, I got emotional just listening to that. Like, yeah. Thank you so much, Warren. Thank you, Qobani. Unfortunately, it's a minute past 5. So, and Warren has to go, but colleagues, I think, are welcome to stay if they want to discuss. I'd like to invite everyone for our forthcoming seminar series this week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. We have doctoral seminar series on Wednesday with Leah Jung. Tomorrow on Tuesday, we have Robbie Shiliam and Sabato Nyamsenda. And on Thursday, we have Professor Susan Levine. So this week is jam-packed at Huma. Please consult our website for further details. Thank you so much, Qobani and Warren, for your insightful book, and we look forward to engaging more.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everybody for your time. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.